In this section, we'll take a look at functions, and the first thing I want to point out is that functions are first-class objects. That means they can be assigned to variables and passed as arguments or return values from other functions, which makes it possible to implement functional programming patterns. In Dart, we don't have a function keyword. To define a function, simply decide on a name and then add parentheses to the end of it, then add braces, and you've defined a function. A function definition by itself doesn't do anything, so to call the function and execute the code, you reference it by name along with parentheses. Currently, the function has no return value, so it infers a return type of null. We can strongly type it by adding the type in front of the function name. We can then add a return statement that returns the corresponding type, and that would give us a function that we could then use to set the value for a variable. And in this case, we can actually remove the string type from the function definition because it will automatically infer that type based on the return value. Now we can also pass arguments into the function by defining parameters. Each parameter has a type definition and a name. Then when we go to call the function, we can pass those arguments to it. In this case, we have a positional parameter, which will always be required. But it's very common in Dart, and especially Flutter, to use name parameters instead of positional parameters because they generally make your code more readable. You can define named parameters for your function by adding braces around them. This will make passing an argument to them optional, but Dart will complain about that because it doesn't want to allow a null value. You can get around that by adding a question mark to the type to make it nullable, or you can add the required keyword to make that argument required when it's called. Another option is to set a default value with the equal sign, which will use that value unless a different value is passed when it's called. Now, when we go to call the function, we reference the arguments by name. We say name, value for each argument that we want to pass in. A is required in this case, and then we can optionally pass in a value for B as well. And unlike positional parameters, it doesn't matter which order we pass these arguments to the function. And again, I'll just mention that named parameters are very common in Flutter, and in fact, they're required on all Flutter widgets. In the last example, we used braces to define the function body, but there's actually a more concise syntax called an arrow function. The function definition looks the same at first, but when you get to the braces, you instead use an arrow, which will implicitly tell the function to return the value on the right side. In this case, it would return a string, and the benefit to writing a function this way is that you can fit everything on one line. This comes in really handy when passing functions as arguments, which comes into play all the time when working with Flutter, like when a user clicks on a button, you might have a function to handle it. In situations like that, it often doesn't make sense to name your function and instead just use an anonymous function. Here's an example. We have a function that takes a function as an argument, but instead of naming it, we just do parentheses with an arrow function, which keeps our code nice and concise and doesn't require us to come up with a name every time we want to define a function somewhere. To wrap up this section, I'll give you a challenge. Define a function that takes another function as an argument and then calls that function inside of its own body. That's known as a callback function and a feature of many different Dart APIs that you'll come across.